Today we are joined with some very special guests, our very own project manager, Thomas Humphreys. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Ashley.
And our very own product marketing manager, Matt Delman. How's it going, Matt?
Hi, Ashley. Happy to be here today.
Just a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out this recording along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. You're all currently muted, but we encourage participation, so please put any questions in our Q&A box so we can go over them at the end of the webinar. Looks like today Thomas will be discussing the SIG 2024 questionnaire. So Thomas, I'll go ahead and pitch things over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And is the screen okay? Can we see the screen, Ashley, Matthew?
Yes.
Yep, fantastic. So yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thomas Humphreys and I'll be taking you through today's webinar, doing a deeper dive into SIG 2024 and taking apart some of the bigger changes and how we can use them when thinking about existing or upcoming or new TPRM programs and activities. Just a very quick bit of background about myself. So I've been with Prevalent for just over 5 years now, principally involved in developing assessments and content using the likes of the SIG and other notable standards and best practice frameworks out there. I was previously an auditor for the best part of 10 years, working in certification bodies in the UK and in Singapore, and dealing with organisations on a global scale, both large and small. As indicated, throughout today, we're aiming for about 55 minutes or so for the presentation, following which we should have time for some Q&A. So any questions come to mind, feel free to place them into the relevant Q&A window. So let's make a start and take a look at some of the key areas that we'll be covering today. So we'll start, as always, with an introduction. Particularly those who may be new to SIG as an assessment, as a framework, before doing a quick comparison between what happened and some of the notable changes in 2023 version and comparing that to what's happened in 2024. We'll then look at a deeper dive into perhaps two of the more notable and perhaps more sort of far-reaching impact areas in artificial intelligence and supply chain. We'll take a wider look at some other areas around controls, control groups, and control attributes and what they mean, for turning our attention then to how we can use the existing SIG in your, as say, either existing or new TPRM program, and then looking at some last minute sort of steps and where do we go from here. So let's start with an introduction. So the SIG is a framework developed by a company called Shared Assessments. This is assessment that's conducted or built on a yearly basis, and there's a yearly cycle of review. And it's been going for many, many years. Essentially, it's a framework that helps organizations, regardless of industry, regardless of sector. It has a database of controls and control requirements to assess organizations, whether it's their own internal organization or certainly for the purposes of this webinar, for third parties and for third-party organizations and vendors. And it's a very comprehensive suite of practices and control requirements that the SIG covers. As of currently, we're looking at a total of 21 different control groups. And in a short while, I'll go through exactly what those control groups are and what they look like. The SIG offers various different scoping levels. So whether you're looking at very small concentrated assessments, very large in-depth and detailed assessments, SIG has different levels and capabilities for scoping out across what it calls its core and light range of assessments. And again, we can go into a bit more detail later on in terms of perhaps some of the key differences between what we call a core and what we call a light assessment. And as I say, it covers a range of best practices, including cyber and information security, information and data privacy, governance and management control points, and compliance control points as well. So there's a range of different topics. Some of these are relatively new, looking over the last 12 months. So the likes of ESG, which came into play last year, and some of them are long-running, ongoing topics, such as access management or incident management, for example, or risk management and risk assessment, which are seen as regular best practices that are adjusted and reviewed on a yearly basis. So a lot of different topics, a lot of different areas for organizations to get their teeth into. But the key thing to state at this stage is the SIG provides you with that almost library, if you will, or database of lots of different touch points with which you can then assess a third party against, again, as I say, across these 21 individual control groups. So we're looking at 2024 now. And as I say, every year, 23, 22, 21, there's always a yearly iteration of the assessment. So I guess we need to understand, well, why is it reviewed on a yearly basis? What's the purpose of going through such an annual review? Not too dissimilar to other organizations who review sometimes annually, sometimes less frequently. Ultimately, we're looking at, or the purpose of these reviews that shared assessments go through, is to look at what did we write last year based on feedback from our members, looking at how the assessment is used across, as I say, a variety of industries and sectors, and looking at new and emerging topics. What do we need to adjust to make the SIG or maintain the relevancy of the SIG? So there's an opportunity to address and identify weaknesses or areas for improvement. Are the topics that are identified from previous years, maybe been going for several years, that are now surplus to requirement? Because again, new and emerging technologies or other key topics have come to the fore, and they have replaced perhaps what was previously written. Are there brand new topics and areas of interest? Again, looking at a broad range of industries and sectors. We'll be covering two of the key areas today in terms of artificial intelligence and supply chain, or SCRM. And then looking at the standards and regulations and the best practice frameworks that can be mapped against the SIG. And it's whether we're aligning or there's a need to align to a new standard or to a new law or regulation, or whether there's a need to realign because a standard and regulation has been updated. So, for example, the new ISO 27001/2022, not so new anymore. But sometimes there's a need to make necessary adjustments to make sure we're in line with the terminologies, the terms of reference, and new controls as well. And so to improve that language and align that language to best practices. So there's various different steps that go through in terms of standards development, and it's a long, detailed process that shared assessments get involved with and spreads to its wider membership base. So that it reaches a point, as we are now, where we have a new and updated version of the framework, which hopefully adds that same value, relevant touch points based on new and emerging topics, and in some cases, brand new standards, law and regulatory mappings as well. So there's a lot of activity that gets involved throughout this whole process. So let's take a quick look back at what happened in 2023. So SIG 2023 built on the improvements of 2022, and in some cases turned some critical topics into some standalone domains. So areas such as fourth and nth party management and ESG for the first time became individual sections, individual control domains or control areas with which organizations could use and could assess businesses against. And as you can see here, there were 19 individual domains. Overall, there was an increased focus around some governance and management level areas. So areas such as enterprise risk management, which expanded this emphasis on, we're not just focused on risk from a, say, cyber or an information security perspective, we're looking at the business and operations as a whole. And so the controls and even the names of the domains reflected that direction as well. I mentioned earlier, obviously, the need to align to new and emerging standards and best practices. And so there are a few new areas added last year. So FedRAMP, FFIEC outsourcing, NERC, and ESG. You'll notice with a lot of these frameworks, there's a lot of different terminologies and buzzwords and acronyms that we use. Just a quick review of some of these. So obviously ESG, environmental, social, and governance requirements. NERC, which is a security guideline for vendor risk management lifecycle. It's very much a US critical infrastructure focused framework. And FFIEC outsourcing, which is more focused around financial institutions or federal financial institutions in the US. And so it gives an indication of where standards are brought in. As I say, although the SIG in itself can be applied regardless of industry and sector, and size and complexity of organization. Naturally, as we see more and more industry bodies and regulatory bodies take note of supply chain management, third-party risk management, cybersecurity, and privacy management, naturally we'll see a need for more mappings for some sector-specific standards and regulations, as well as more wider-reaching some industry sector agnostic regulations or standards such as ISO or NIST or CAIQ from a cloud perspective as well. So that's what happened at the back end of, or at the end of 2022 for the new standard and an assessment for the current year we're in. So what's changed in 2024? So one of the areas that does occur each year is look at this, the volume of questions that are on offer, the SIG core and the SIG Lite. I mentioned there's two variants. Typically, we're seeing there is a slight reduction in question volumes over the years. To give an indication, the SIG Lite is looking at around the 125 mark in terms of 125 individual questions. The core is around the 620 mark or thereabouts. So it gives an indication of the level of depth that, say, a core set of questions or the core library goes to, as opposed to the light library within the SIG. One of the key areas to note is if we look at the right-hand side of the screen and in bold, I've already touched on them at the beginning. There's two new domain areas under AI and supply chain risk management. So it's increased the overall volume of domainers to 21 now. But when you look across at the other areas, there are some slight name changes, but generally the key topics remain. So from risk and third-party management, asset, HR and operational controls, technical capabilities such as incidents and resilience, and endpoint and network security, to more compliance areas around general compliance management, broadly speaking, to again ESG and information and data privacy as well. So an expansion of control areas is the first notable change, and as I say, we'll go into detail on those two in bold later on. There's also been a significant focus on controls, control families, and particularly control attributes, and where control categories and particularly attributes appear across multiple domains and questions. And this is for me one of the most interesting areas and can prove to be the most useful, particularly when we're using the SIG-24 moving forward in terms of assessing not only our our range of third parties and vendors, particularly where we're starting to provide more focus around, say, tiered or tiering of vendors, for example, or to deal with different size and complexities of vendors as well. Increased standards mapping as well, particularly around cyber and third-party management. As we'll see later on, some of the, I guess you could say, usual suspects around, such as the new 27001 framework and PCI DSS for payment cards, they've been updated over the past 12 to 18 months. So it's only natural that those changes were reflected in the new SIG. But also some brand new control areas, not least standards mappings, not least around NIST 800-161, which is the cybersecurity supply chain risk management standard from NIST. And with the same organization, the AI RMF, or Artificial Intelligence Risk Management Framework, which forms the core and the basis for the new AI component as well. So lots of different standards, mappings, and regulations, some of which we'll see in a bit more detail later. And AI and supply chain risk management captured as new, if you want, standalone control domains. And a lot of this, I think, is quite reflective of certainly what we're seeing against outside of any particular industry, but across the board, both interest, certainly in the use and the speed with which AI is being used or is being asked, and companies are developing systems around the concept of AI, but also this need to have greater focus and accountability around supply chain and supply chain risk management. So this is very timely that shared assessments have added these into the SIG into 2024. And I think it's good because it helps to represent those changing views, concerns, and expectations, I'd say, regardless of industry or sector. So let's take a look firstly at two of the new control groups, starting with artificial intelligence. So a massive topic, as I'm sure we're all very familiar, not least with the advent of tools such as ChatGPT and many others that are actively in development. And I mentioned when we look at the SIG 2024, it focuses on or uses the NIST AI RMF as the baseline standard in terms of standards mapping. And this is really one of the first formal standards that's been released around AI. Naturally, there are a lot more coming up, and we can see moving into next year, whether it's the likes of ISO, whether it's country-specific regulation or more global regulations, EU AI Act, for example, or other consolidated best practice standards. There will be a lot that's coming out over the next 12 months, certainly. But certainly the NIST AI RMF is an excellent starting point, and it's certainly seen as one of the drivers in terms of trying to establish some best practice, or at least some clear guidance. And what does this look like in practice in terms of controls? Well, again, using the RMF as the baseline, the SIG 24 has split controls into three key areas, what they call govern or governance-based controls, map or mapping-based controls, and measurement-based controls. What does this mean? What does this look like? So as we can see from a governance-based perspective, the focus is very much around development of a risk culture, an AI risk culture, developing policy and process. So developing controls to help manage awareness of legal regulatory considerations, for example, when using AI. This concept of trustworthiness or trustworthy AI, I'll explain in a short while in terms of some of these new terminologies. There's certainly a lot when we're looking at artificial intelligence to consider. Policies around data governance, system impact related to AI and AI connectivity. So, for example, where an AI system is being developed and the connectivity to critical infrastructure, to external networks, development, design, testing of AI systems, all of these areas wrap around the set of govern-based controls that are captured in the new SIG. Certainly when we're looking at SIG Core versus SIG Lite has very much a more reduced set of controls to cover the govern, map, and measurement elements, with the Core having a lot more depth around each of these respective areas. So the thought process around the application, the design, and the testing of AI systems, for example, or development of policies and roles and responsibilities in terms of managing an AI system or managing the risk associated with AI. From a mapping perspective, we were looking at all about identifying that context of an AI system. So what is the system going to do? What won't it do? How do we categorize and inventory our AI systems, or at least thinking from a third party, how do they inventory our AI systems? Have they identified the cost and benefits of the use of AI? And have they assessed a level of impact that the AI system will have? So impact to other systems, individuals, groups, even society for that matter, depending on where the system's being used and if it's being used in the public domain. So the controls are really trying to focus around, has an organization, has a third party got a clear statement and got a clear process in place for identifying what the system's going to do, how it's going to operate, what risks, what benefits, what level of impact is the use of this AI system going to bring, and then naturally the level of controls that are then going to be applied to protect that. So whether it's privacy-based controls or cybersecurity-based controls or safety-based controls, for example. And then finally, there's measurement controls around as well, captured within the SIG Core and Lite as well. And as you'd expect from measurement controls, that focus around, well, how do we assess and analyze and track risk? Are there any metrics that are being developed so that we look at the short and long term process of managing risks in an effective manner? So AI RMF very much focused around the risk concept and the risk side of AI, but the purpose very much is having that understanding and that confidence that third parties developing an AI system has conducted a very thorough risk analysis and risk approach, and have identified exactly what the system's going to do, how it's going to be protected, how it's going to be secured. Again, particularly when we're looking at very sensitive topics around the type of data it's accessing, for example. Now, before I move on, you can see on the right-hand side there are new terminology that's captured, as always, with new technologies or new topics. This is just a few areas, so the concepts of trustworthiness, building trustworthiness into an AI system, AI actors, key responsibilities in terms of the overall interaction, not just those developing an AI system, but everyone involved, what ISO may call interested parties associated with the system, and AI system inventories. And certainly one of the difficult components at the first with any new technology or system, not least around AI, of course, is, well, how do we translate that, particularly when we're engaging with a third party? If we're trying to ask pertinent questions around how have they developed their AI system and how have they scoped it to make sure that they have done the necessary due diligence and impact assessment, how do we communicate what we mean by have they considered trustworthiness within the system? Within the SIG assessment itself, outside of setting questions and control domains, domain families, so AI, access control, asset management, there are objectives and control statements that are updated on a yearly basis as well and refined. And the purpose of this is to help bridge that gap in understanding. So setting the scene around what's the purpose of this domain, what's it trying to achieve, or what are we trying to get out of this? And so to give you an example, when we're looking at the concept of trustworthiness, SIG states, among other areas, the ability to create standards to encourage that creation of development methods that emphasize this concept of trustworthiness. So what we're talking about with trustworthiness, we're looking at the accuracy and safety of that AI system. the level of security and system and data and information resilience, what level of accountability and transparency in terms of what it's going to do with the data, how it's going to process and access the data, privacy protection and fairness, so that if a system's going out in the public domain, for example, if it's a system that's going to be used to make decisions and there'll be actions and consequences as a result of those decisions, there are steps throughout the process, whether it's through the design, the risk assessment and the testing, to make sure that bias is removed as practically as possible, particularly anything that could be considered as harmful bias. So SIG, as well as establishing key questions in alignment to areas such as the AI RMF standard, it then starts to extract further information to help companies make those decisions around, well, what are we trying to get out of these domains and these domain questions, and certainly having clear objectives and control statements and even risk statements in terms of what is a risk if this were to occur, or for not implementing this control, starts to make it a lot clearer, particularly when we're looking at and making a decision around, are these controls important to us? And these are sort of controls or control groups that we want to assess our third parties against. So what are the core concerns that Section R, AI, can address within the SIG? So certainly by having a greater visibility of the type of risks and how risk assessments are being performed on AI systems, we can start to glean information around, well, how's a third party addressing privacy, ability, reliability, and accuracy of the data and how the data is being processed? What resiliency, security, and safety measures are being implemented? And particularly thinking about development and testing, and thinking about the traditional development lifecycle models, how they're building these controls and criteria into the development process, and hopingly to address and make visible in terms of the level of fairness that the AI system is going to be used, how it's going to be utilized, and what it's going to be doing with that information and data. Because, of course, when we're thinking about what type of risks should we be concerned about when we're looking at AI, there's a lot of different risks, but certainly some of the areas, I guess, are more pertinent at this stage are areas around, obviously, security vulnerabilities in the AI application itself. So if there's a lack of governance, if there's a lack of clear safeguards in place, is it going to mean greater exposure to system and even data compromise, for example? Is there a lack of transparency in methodologies that are being used to measure and understand AI risk when the system is being developed? And if there are deficiencies in those measurements and reporting, is it going to increase that impact of potential AI risks that are not being appropriately identified, addressed, captured, and managed through the use of safety, security, privacy controls, and other governance-based controls as well? And then thinking about AI security policies specifically, if there's inconsistency with other risk management procedures. So we're talking here about identifying, reviewing AI risk, as I said, but looking back at the original slides around the topics, we can see that there's enterprise risk within the SIG as well. So there's already control areas that touch on wider ranging organizational, operational risk and risk management practices. So what are we doing about artificial intelligence? Is it isolated, or are we bringing it to the fore as part of wider enterprise risks that has perhaps a greater visibility across top management, for example? And on the right, as you can see, in following the same vein as the NIST AI RMF and the way the controls have been developed in SIG, we can see those three cornerstones of govern, mapping, and measurement of risk. There is a fourth one you can see there around managing. So risks are prioritized and acted upon based on the projected impact. And this is where, when we look at how to implement, or if we're implementing or utilizing those Section R criteria when engaging with third parties, we then need to think about that whole management piece of how do we manage the risk remediation, the risk mitigation, and risk treatment, where risks around these areas are picked up or are captured. Secondly is Section S, or Supply Chain Risk Management. So you may have noticed earlier that we already have another area that captures elements of external parties in Section B, called nth party management. But there are key differentiators between the both. Certainly when you think of and look at Section B around nth party, the focus is more around the third party management component and requirements, whether it's from setting controls and criteria from a contractual and agreement perspective, access by third parties to scope systems and scopes data. Following a similar pattern to the NIST 800-161 standard, Section S looks at the wider supply chain framework and how we deal with and consider risk associated with supply chain. Associated with cybersecurity risk management. So as I say, 800-161 has been mapped in quite a lot of depth to Section S. And one of the benefits here, of course, is it now allows organizations to apply supply chain specific requirements to security and privacy controls. If anyone's not familiar or as familiar with 800-161, the focus from NIST here has been on looking at the full end-to-end from A to Z of supply chain risk management. Apologies for the intrusion from Teams there. And so it can be used to assess how third parties have established and considered risk management across the wider supply chain. It covers a lot of detailed areas, including policy, governance, and security practices, some technical components around how do we consider supply chain when we're looking at access control management, the restriction of access. So where there are, if there are suppliers down the wider supply chain that will interact in any capacity with our data, with our information systems, what considered controls do we need to apply from an access management component? Incident management and response, and contingency and resiliency planning as well, and how do we extend this to the wider supply chain group of organizations, and even maintenance of systems, networks, personal data, and data privacy controls, and key roles and responsibilities. So the new Section S in this SIG covers quite a lot of detail, whether it's from a policy perspective, a technical perspective, or a wider governance perspective, particularly, as I say, around incident and business resiliency management as well. And then obviously additional areas that may or may not be appropriate depending on the nature of what a supplier is doing, so the likes of secure software development and the wider software development life cycle as well. So a brand new area focusing very much on the wider supply chain management process, but again, in not too dissimilar to the AI control piece, leveraging a best practice framework, in this case 800-161, to give that viewpoint on wider compliance against managing suppliers and the supply chain. Where it's particularly useful is when you look at the likes of NIST 161, it will take known controls and best practice controls from the likes of 853, so the information security standard, and says, well, how do you apply a supply chain slant on these type of controls? And so we can see a wider focus on not just are you managing your suppliers effectively and through contracts and contractual agreements, but where there's a need for those technical controls, how are they being managed, assessed, recorded, and documented. Lastly, as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I've identified control attributes specifically that are applied in Section S, the SCRM component. So policy, standard and procedures, access control, training, roles, SDLC, business resiliency, and incident management. And this neatly leads on to the next topic, which is covering these changes to control attributes, control standards, and control mappings, and in some cases changing domain names. And why I've particularly called these 9, 10 or so attributes up is it gives an indication of just how wide-reaching the supply chain control family is. So let's have a look a bit more about the concept of these control attributes, standard mappings, and domain names. So as I say, there's significant focus on controls, control families, and control attributes. So what do we mean by this, these control families and attributes? So as you can see on the first blue table, we have identity and access management, which is designated as a control family, which is grouping controls together under a common theme. And what's interesting here, as we can see, this is covered under 7 individual sections of the SIG. So from section D, assets information management, all the way to S, supply chain risk management. So what this means is controls and questions within each of these 7 areas will have a control family titled identity and access management. Alongside this, we then have attributes, and I particularly picked out policy, standards, and procedures. And so the attributes offer a more granular, nuanced view of controls and control families. And this is where it can get quite interesting in terms of how you apply this from a third-party risk perspective, particularly when identifying mandatory controls and mandatory control areas. And so again, as we can see, policy, standard, and procedure, which is listed under identity access management, again is referenced across 5 separate sections. So from section D of the SIG all the way through to section S. And so what this means is we can now apply a very narrow view or a tight view if we're looking at or interested in, for example, how are policies applied and what policies are applied when we're thinking about controls surrounded by identity and access management. So whether it's access authorization, authentication, and monitoring, but across a series of different control areas. So policies associated with identity and access management as part of access control, as part of network security, privacy management, and supply chain. And so what this does is it allows us to have, tighter views or more narrow views on areas that may be mission critical to us as an organization. So, for example, if data security and data access management are considered critical or of concern to yourself as an organization, by being able to map those particular attributes to separate questions, when we have an assessment of a third party against SIG Core or SIG Lite and risks come through, we can then start to look at compliance and compliance ratings. So what level of compliance is met against policy and standard or data security or multi-factor authentication. So it allows us to have some very good viewpoints, whether it's at an individual third-party basis or across a broad range of third parties. So are there trends we're seeing based on particular control attributes or control families that may be giving us cause for concern? On top of this, I did mention this increased standards mapping, particularly around cyber and third-party management. So in the pink shade, we can see 8 separate and new standards that have been mapped into SIG 24. So CMMC2, Supply Chain Act, which is the German Supply Chain Act, which is focused more from an environmental and ESG perspective. Interagency guidance on third-party relationships, more focusing around the banking sector. CIS, Center for Internet Security, version 8. As we've mentioned, 800.161 around the supply chain risk management process and AI risk management framework. And the NYDFS guidelines or new guidelines focused again around climate guidance. So what this means in practice is there'll be some areas such as the NYDFS and AIRMF that will be focused on particular aspects of the SIG only, so most notably around ESG and AI risk, for example. And there'll be others such as CIS version 8 that will be naturally be spread out across multiple out of the full 21 sections, because the controls that CIS, for example, covers, or the controls that CMMC covers, spread across multiple topics and different topics as well. We can also see 3 standards that already existed in the SIG, but have been updated again to reflect the updates that the respective standard bodies have made. So for ISO 27002, the 2022, which is the implementation of Annex A controls, and 27001, the certifiable standard, and PCI DSS, the payment card standard, which was upgraded to version 4, I believe just a little over a year ago now. So a lot of different standards mappings, and this expands everything that was already in place to begin with. So the likes of 853 for NIST, for example, or CAIQ for cloud and cloud security standards as well. So if you think about all those different aspects, some of the new topics, and certainly thinking about the differences between a SIG Lite and a SIG Core, where SIG Lite takes a smaller snapshot of the controls and SIG Core is a more in-depth, in some cases, much greater depth in terms of controls and where the controls go. The SIG framework can help organizations when developing an approach to assessing third parties. So if you think about your standard process of saying, well, what assessments do we use? Is it fit for purpose? We need to start making sure we've got the right assessment to fit the right type of organization, whether it's multinationals or small organizations, whether it's a profile, whether it's a tiered organization, a tier 1 vendor, tier 2 or tier 3, or high, medium, low, whatever the case may be. Then that process of how do we engage the third party to get them to complete a SIG assessment, and then making sure when risks come back, we know what to do with them, and then we can report back on the results to executive management, to the board, and to other interested parties. So certainly thinking of the first 2 areas around assessment identification and profiling and tiering, this is where the use of the SIG Lite and SIG Core come in, and are quite important at this early stage. So if you're thinking about the complexity and type of third parties that we're dealing with, what is going to be more appropriate to us, a core or a light assessment? It may be that given the criticality of what a third party is providing, or the size and the complexity of the organization, or the fact that they're listed as a tier 1 third party, that a SIG Core assessment is more relevant. It's a significantly larger assessment, but it will give a lot more detail and understanding around timely and critical topics. It may be on the other angle that an organization is a much smaller footprint in terms of the products and service provision to the organization. It might be a lower tier. It might be physically smaller in terms of a very small organization. And so a light may be a more appropriate a use case for that type of organization. So the fact that the SIG gives those good capabilities to have both parts of the puzzle, so to speak, the very in-depth and complex assessment, the lighter touch assessment that still touches on those 21 critical control areas or control families, can help to make it much easier in making that decision around which assessment is fit for purpose. It's important to note as well, before we go on, in terms of the light and the core, I've been talking about the fact that there are 21 individual control areas. And again, the library is set up such that there's not always going to be a need to access all 21 areas. In some cases, there will be. But given that each area is isolated, so to speak, or captured in a single domain, does make it much easier, particularly when you're looking at that profiling and tiering, to say, well, AI is not as necessary for us in this component, or given what the third parties are doing, maybe ESG is not as critical at this point in time, and so we'll only focus on the cybersecurity and compliance elements, for example, or AI is mission critical based on what our third parties are doing. And so that automatically becomes one of the critical areas that we want to assess our third party against. And then thinking back to the control families and the control attributes, so we decided that we can use a light, or we can use a core, or we may use a combination of both, if appropriate. What control families are critical to us? What do we need to pay attention to, particularly when we're looking at the tail end of risk management component and working out the risks that are coming back? How do they impact us as an organization? If we've identified those mandatory control areas, maybe there are attributes around data security, the use of multi-factor authentication, for example, resiliency and contingency requirements, for example, and we may want to call those out, both within the assessment as part of assessment identification, but also internally, so that if or when those risks do occur, we know that we need to spend more time focusing on the remediation process with the vendor, or we need to be asking the vendor to complete certain actions outside of that so that we can address those risks appropriately. And of course, there's always going to be a dotted line then back to the final level of reporting in terms of those assessing those third-party assessment results. And again, using those control domains, families, control attributes can then make it easier, particularly when trying to sum up and look at the overall compliance picture based on those SIG requirements and SIG control points. SIG framework enables organizations to assess third parties against structured assessments, or to tailor each assessment based on control domains, families, and attributes. So again, thinking about having those control domains providing visibility on security, privacy, business systems, and practices. What's important to yourself as an organization? And do we need to send shortened surveys or wider surveys based on the control domains that are important to us? And again, that flexibility of taking a domain in isolation or taking a wide variety of domains, so from section A through to section V, around cloud security, for example, should really help to sort of set that scene and making sure we're asking the right questions and the right topics to our third parties. That flexibility and that depth of review, based on whether it's a full or core or a light assessment, is quite critical as well. The worst thing is providing assessments to a third party that then become irrelevant because the controls haven't been identified or reviewed properly, or it's too much, particularly given the size and complexity of the organization, for example. So providing an organization consisting of 2 personnel or 3 personnel who have very minimal hardware and infrastructure, a survey of several hundred questions may be over the top, whereas a more light-based assessment where you're touching on all the high-level topics still across continuity, asset management, incident response may be far more appropriate. So that flexibility and that depth of review is critical, and that ability that the SIG has to tailor that depth based on individual and modularized, if you will, domain areas. That identification of the critical control areas, so having that think about ESG, and particularly now around supply chain and AI. What does it mean to us? And particularly, what does it mean to our industry and sector? So as we've seen, there are more sector-specific standards mappings that are coming in place within the SIG, on top of international-wide or national-wide standards such as ISO and NIST. But it may be that you're in an industry and sector where these topics are becoming to the fore, that are becoming hot topics of discussion. We know, for example, looking at the financial sector and the financial industry, both in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, in other geographies as well, that the concepts around due diligence, around supply chain risk management, around outsourcing, are picking up pace, and there are more guidelines, there are more requirements coming out from different regulators around how organizations apply that due diligence. So in some cases, it may be through the industry, and to demonstrate through the industry that best practices are in place, that there is a need to use, for example, Section S, supply chain risk management. That's going to provide you that good overview and that good level of due diligence that when you're engaging with the industry or sector leaders or regulators, that you can say we've done our due diligence against our wider supply chain. And again, linking it back to known standards as well, such as the 800-161. So there's a lot of consideration about how you can use all aspects or different aspects or isolated aspects of the SIG, whether it's large or small, whether it's individual control or domain areas, or whether it's individual attributes that are important to yourself as an organization or a sector. And this should then make for a much more value-adding assessment, particularly when you can then start to demonstrate that mandatory control areas have good rates of compliance, where there are low rates of compliance based on the third-party engagement and the third-party assessment results, that you know you're in the right area in terms of targeting remediation and remediation activities. So, if we take a wider view then, what areas should we be focusing on right now? So, for those companies who already use the SIG and have been using it for many, many years, there'll be a lot of familiarity with the version 2024 version. So quickly reviewing the light and the core frameworks, looking at what those changes are, those section Rs, those section S, taking a look at how domain objectives, how new control attributes can be shaped and how they can be joined together, and helping to establish those critical control domains and mandatory requirements. Looking from the standards mapping as well, thinking about some of the new standards that are in place. So, for example, if you're using ISO 27001 or you've been using it for many years, obviously it's very timely and very welcome that there now are good mappings and very clear mappings to the 2022 requirements. So if you're already on 2022 for that standard, for example, that makes it a lot more easier to quickly pinpoint all the controls within the SIG, whether it's core or light, that have been mapped to that particular standard. So identifying which standards, if any, are important to you, which again will help with that mapping of what questions do we want to ask with our third parties. And then finally, identifying where any new control areas may be considered high priority or critical domains. So again, from a regulatory perspective, if supply chain is of top mind or of top of key discussions at the moment, again, it makes sense to start tackling and looking at those sections and to see what type of questions there are and how we can apply them to our third parties. And then finally, obviously, that engagement of the third parties as well. So once we've decided the light and the core, maybe it's based on the level of profiling and tiering. Now we start to assess those third parties. It may be useful that we need both, that there may be based on the tier, we use some light, we use some core, we use a blended approach. But again, through those establishment of those control domains and mandatory requirements, we can start to execute those plans to address risks through mitigation, remediation. And then finally, that continual review of the SIG framework. Although I'd say there's an annual review where SIG is updated. Obviously, in between that, there always may be a chance to review to say, these are the assessments that we've used now. Do they still fit the bill? Or after our use of the light, do we need to progress to more of the core aspects, because it's giving us a far more level of depth in terms of critical control areas or control domains that are important to us as a business. Before we move on to Q&A, I believe my colleague Matthew has a few slides. Matthew.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Just give me one very quick second here. All right, So as Thomas was talking about, we're one of the things that we're working with here at Prevalent is helping you get ahead of third-party risk in a connected world. And obviously, I apologize for these slides. Now, these are the things really in terms of third-party risk management that we at Prevalent here tend to see from customers. They want the data that they need to make better decisions. They want to increase team efficiency and break down silos, and they want to evolve and scale their program. These are the things that we tend to hear a lot. Now, this is really what we focus on here at Prevalent. It's helping you do those things, but it's also these few phases and this really life cycle approach to third-party risk management, from sourcing and selection all the way over to offboarding and termination. And this is really kind of where we look at, where we approach what our product helps to do. These are all of the risks that we use, that we approach, these risk areas from cybersecurity through business and operational, all the way down to compliance risks and ESG. And this is kind of how we automate and accelerate your programs. We have really a three-part program or product of people, data, and platform. We have a managed services team, the Risk Operations Center, the ROC, who does a lot of really good work. We've got your third-party risk intelligence. We do integrate SIG into our platform as well. I'm not sure on the timing of when the SIG 2024 updates will be in platform, but they will go into our platform. And this is, lastly, where we are right now, and these are the resources that you can get for SIG. It's the SIG 2024 key updates and considerations. We've got some items here as well. This is the blog about SIG 2024 and the blog on the site about the standard information gathering questionnaire more generally. So it's an update blog post, and it's also a blog post kind of explaining the assessments more generally. So that is my product spiel, and now I will switch it back over to Ashley for moderating Q&A.
Thanks, Matt. You might have noticed I went ahead and launched our second poll so we can follow up with you regarding any initiatives or projects that you may have. We're just curious to see if you're looking to establish or augment a TPRM program within the year, and please be honest, because we do follow up with you, but we got a couple minutes left on the clock, so let's go ahead and get through some of these questions.
Some interesting questions, actually. There's
yes.
So
do you have one you'd like to answer?
yeah, so there's a few that's come in. So thank you very much for anyone who's asked a question. So very quickly, how many questions are there in the 2024 SIG Core and Lite? Core on its own is 620 questions, and the Lite is 125. So that's a total of 745. My math is correct. If you're to combine both SIG Core and SIG Lite in its entirety, I'd say key difference is Lite takes all of the same 21 domain areas, but applies a much more light touch. What that means in practice is, for example, where the core may go to the nth degree in terms of business impact assessments and continuity management plans, Lite will only touch on those pertinent aspects around, do you have a continuity plan in place? Is it tested, for example? Do you have key roles? How widely adopted is the use of the SIG in the context of Europe versus USA? So yes, it's an interesting point. So in terms of when you look across the standards and the standards mappings, there's quite a few standards that have been mapped specifically to US-based regulators or federal agencies or institutions. But equally so, there's a lot that are increasing, not just in the US, but globally as well. particularly with the likes of ESG. As I mentioned, the German supply chain act or requirements is very much focused around ESG. I'd say generally there's a wider adoption in the US, but that's not to say it's only US centric. There are a lot of organizations globally that are making use of the SIG, particularly again, given that the level of standards mapping is incorporating so many internationally recognized standards, and the topics as well are of use across, regardless of geography, regardless of location. How are we doing on the clock, Ashley? Are we good for?
Why don't we go ahead and answer one more question? I know we're coming up on time here.
Okay, what would you recommend when to use SIG or cake? So as said, good question. So the cake is a cloud management standard for cloud organizations, for cloud hosting organizations. So the SIG does give a lot of depth, particularly in the core, with relating to managing and securing tenant data and controls focused around securing data through backup, through testing, and through threat management as well, particularly when you engage with a cloud provider. Certainly, Cake will go into a lot more detail and depth in terms of minimum requirements for if you're a cloud hosted provider, for example, for infrastructure or software as a service. So I guess it depends on which side of the coin you are. For many companies, if you're making use of a cloud provider such as Amazon or Dropbox or a similar cloud solution, SIG generally will give you a lot more depth across a broader range of topics than the Cake would give. So it really depends on, I guess, which side of the coin you're on.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Thomas, Matt, and everyone for all of your questions. They both gave us some great information to take in today, and I hope to see all of you either in your inbox or at a future Prevalent webinar. Cheers, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks all.